Hey everybody, it is your instructor Melissa. I'm recording the first of two screencasts that I am going to make available to you for this week in preparation for our last week of classes, which is next week. Sorry I didn't get these done yesterday, but I was still recovering from my surgery and didn't even get home from the hospital till quite late. So I guess it has to be today. So anyway, we're going to start out with part 1 of chapter 15, and then we're going to move on in the next PowerPoint slash video to part 2. And I do want to start chapter or this part off though with the last image that we saw when we met last, which was the anastasis, which is from chapter 8. So remember that we're skipping a large portion of the book. We're already on chapter 15 because we're not covering the non-Western sections of the textbook. So in case you're confused about that, we are on chapter 15, and some in your packet, I guess I should say, we're on page 17, I do believe. I did want to warn you that I am recording this in my pajamas on my couch at home recovering, and I have 3 dogs, so it may be that we might hear barking. When that happens, especially because my Jack Russell is actually right at the window right now looking for something to bark at, it will happen, and when it does, I'll try to just pause and then pick up afterwards, so hopefully that won't be too much of a distraction. All right, so like I said, I wanted to start out with the last image that we saw the last time we met, which is still from chapter 8, still from the Byzantine chapter, and that was the funerary chapel at the monastery in Kora of Constantinople. So remember Constantinople, this is the heart of the Byzantine Empire. We've been looking at Byzantine art as mostly, figural narrative images done in mosaic, but what's cool about Kora, what's different, especially about the funerary chapel, is that it's done in painting, which is pretty rare in the Byzantine world, simply because they prefer mosaic. It seems to be a sort of, as we said, a geographical preference, as we see that mosques in that area often use mosaic as well. So that makes it kind of interesting. I think you can kind of tell looking around at this image of the chapel that it's in painting. I think you can kind of sense the difference in the quality of the surface and how it's not got that sort of broken appearance like mosaics tend to do. What I want to do though is draw your attention to the coolest, best part of the chapel, which is the apse sort of image. Of course, it's not an apse mosaic, it's an apse painting up in the large lunette above the apse. And this is an okay image. This is a good image, I think, of that particular chapel. So again, we're here, but I think the color might be a little off, but it's really hard to get good color, accurate color. So anyway, this is an image of a narrative scene. So we've seen in Christian art lots of different narratives become popular. We've seen the crucifixion become popular, especially the St. John's crucifixion with John the Evangelist and the Virgin Mary and the thieves and the Roman soldiers and so on. We haven't seen the Nativity become popular yet. That's for down the road. And this is one kind of narrative that really only seems to be popular really in Orthodoxy. It's kind of an apocryphal story, meaning that it's not like official scripture, but it's one that is believed by the church. It's one of those sort of extra books of the Bible. And it is a story known that we call as the anastasis, or the harrowing of hell. So anastasis, this is a Greek word, of course, that means rising or resurrection. So what we see in the anastasis is not just the resurrection really, but specifically what happens after the resurrection. So in other images of the resurrection, which we've seen a few, at least a couple of our book images, is that Christ rises from the tomb, he leaves the tomb, he looks intact and human, although he has the stigmata, and he greets the Marys and he says, "Do not touch me," etc. So this is another sort of part of that story that is not believed by everyone, but is sort of an apocryphal story, and it is the harrowing of hell. Harrowing of hell is what happens when Christ is said to, after resurrecting, to break down the doors of hell. Okay, so what we're seeing here is that moment when he's broken down the doors of hell. So he fights the devil, breaks down the doors of hell, and what does he do? Well, he rescues everyone, because remember, in Christianity, because of original sin, which is the sin of the sin of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, eating from the tree of knowledge and disobeying God, that there's a curse on humanity, including not being able to get into heaven, okay, or not being able to return to paradise. So remember that one of the core sort of important things about Christianity is this idea that with Christ's sacrifice of his own self, it makes it so that everyone can go to heaven. That's one of the really core sort of beliefs of Christianity. So what he's doing here is, having resurrected, having sacrificed himself, it's a very literal description of bringing everyone out of hell and into heaven. Hope that makes sense. So he breaks down the doors of hell in a very literal sense. They're right here. These two wooden planks. You see all these little white doodads on the ground. Well, what these are supposed to be little mechanical parts of locks. So the idea is that, hell was locked up tight and ain't nobody getting out of there right until Christ comes. So all of those locks are broken. And then here we have a figure, looks like almost mummified and tied up, and that is supposed to be the devil, who's been now defeated by Christ. So here's Christ in a pretty, for the Byzantine world, pretty active sort of pose. In fact, he's visibly, you can see, yanking two people out of sarcophagi, out of graves. And these are Eve and Adam, the first two people to have gone to hell, I suppose. So then we also have Old Testament saints and New Testament figures around Christ witnessing this. And this is, of course, just the first of everyone who will be released from hell. It's just kind of a neat image. It's something we will not see in the West. It's something that is not popular in the West. So I wanted to be sure we understood what was going on here. Again, a pretty active moment, right, where they're literally sort of leaping out of their sarcophagi. Christ has a mandala about him that's filled with stars, and a kind of fantasy landscape of the gates to hell. So that is the anastasis. Okay, so let us start by taking a look at chapter 15 at a couple of maps. That's always a good place to start. And you can look at this map. This is a nice sort of old style map, very pretty. But what is important for us here is that it shows us how in the West the former Roman Empire is getting divided. You don't have to know all these different kingdoms, but I did want you to have an idea of what it looks like and how different it looks from Rome proper. Now, remember that the Middle Ages, right, which is this period as noted in your packet from 476 to 1000, begins with the end of the Western Roman Empire, right? So what we're going to talk about in chapter 15, chapter 16, and chapter 17 is what happens in the West during the time that we've already covered in the Byzantine world. So remember, in the Byzantine world over here on the right-hand side, they continue as a quote-unquote Roman Empire for 1,000 years. But on the West, they do not. In fact, the various areas of the Western Roman Empire are basically taken over by the people who had been ruled. So you have a Visigothic kingdom, you have an Ostrogothic kingdom, you have the Kingdom of Lombardia, you have what's known as the Holy Roman Empire, which we'll talk about later. You have all of these different areas, like the Vandal Kingdom, ruled by groups of people who had previously been ruled by the Romans. And so we have kind of the beginnings of dividing Europe up into these relatively smaller kingdoms that we see the sort of remnants of today in the countries of Europe. So we say the Middle Ages begins at 476, when this process really happens in proper. And we say that the Middle Ages ends at about 1400. The time period covered by this chapter is 476 to 1000, is what we know as the early Middle Ages. And then the next two chapters cover the Romanesque period and the Gothic period. So those periods lead us up to about 1400 or 1300. So these groups of people who sacked the western half of Rome are those people that the Romans called barbarians. Remember, those were people that were not able to speak Latin or preferred not to speak Latin because they spoke their own languages, who had their own sort of ways of doing things. They probably had their own religions, but they had been ruled by the Romans, and so sometimes they had Roman religion as well as their own religion, but we'll see over the course of this chapter that these groups of people eventually end up converting to Christianity as well, like the Romans did. Some of them to a much slower degree than others. Your book makes a lot about the Franks picking up Christianity, but actually there's a Frankish king who held out for a long time. They were very defiant. Another defiant group were the Norse people we know as the Vikings, defiant regarding adopting Christianity. But still, this is the time period, chapter 15, the early Middle Ages, when the spread of Christianity throughout Europe, the sort of codification of Christianity as the European religion is happening. And of course, we're not just talking about Christianity, we're talking about Catholicism, right? Which is becomes the dominant form of Christianity in the West. So why do we call this period the Middle Ages? Well, the reason for that, I think, is because historically, as we've talked about before, we know that these terms, they have loaded meanings, right? Well, historically, the Middle Ages has been looked at by historians, art historians, other kinds of historians, as a sort of long waiting period almost. And I think we try to use the term neutrally today, but how the term came about is that people saw this period as just a time in between two great time periods, that it was sort of a kind of not so great period in between two great periods. So the first great period, of course, being ancient Rome, or the Greco-Roman world of the past. And then that ended in 476. And then the Middle Ages ends with another great period beginning, the Renaissance, which we talk about a lot in 282 next semester. So you can learn a little bit about this definition of the Middle Ages in your book. I believe it's on page 431. But know that it's not a neutral term. It's implying the word Middle Ages to describe this 1,000-year period, basically, is implying that it's kind of like a period when not a lot happens, or that it's not very interesting. And of course, that is not true at all. It is just sort of our collective bias in history describing this period, because we love the ancient Greco-Roman world so much, and because we love the Renaissance so much. Sometimes the Middle Ages, I think, was seen as a disappointment. And I think part of it is our preference, frankly, part of it is our preference in the West for realistic art. Of course, ancient Greece and Rome, we think of realistic art there. And in the future, in the Renaissance, we think about realistic art there. And then during the Middle Ages, we don't have a lot of interest in realism. So that's part of our, I think, artistic bias against the Middle Ages. And part of it is, defining the Middle Ages as this sort of, waiting period, this kind of not boring, maybe even horrible period. Part of it is deserved. I mean, this is a time period. I mean, it is a long time period, though. So, of course, a lot of stuff's going to happen in 1,000 years, right? But it is a time period when you have a lot of wars. You have the development of a system called feudalism, which results in basically the near enslavement of millions of people in what we would call sort of agricultural slavery, right? But we have to remember the Romans did that as well. The Romans had agricultural slaves too. They were a slave state as well. We can't just, blame that on the Middle Ages as somehow, feudalism and becoming a peasant was somehow new to the Middle Ages, because it certainly was not. And there were, of course, the Crusades against Islam and against Orthodox Christianity by the Western Catholic Church. And lots of people don't like that about the Middle Ages too. But that it's still a very interesting time. And I would say that even though, kind of looking back from a historical perspective, even though the Crusades were terrible, one thing that it served the West in, not only enriching itself, but also in enriching its sort of artistic cosmopolitanism. So you see a lot of influence from the East in Western European art of the Middle Ages, which is seen as positive in terms of, not making totally homogenous Greco-Roman, old style artwork. And then, of course, finally, another reason why a lot of people don't like the Middle Ages is because of the plagues. But Again, of course, this is something that happens all throughout history. And the plagues don't end with the Middle Ages. The plagues continue into the Renaissance. If you take 282 with me next semester, you'll see that a lot of our artists have the same death year. And that's because because those plagues continue and they wiped out large numbers of people. But during the Middle Ages, during this long period, I mean, some people estimate that up to 2/3 of the population died of the plague. I mean, think about that, every 2 out of 3 people around you dying of a disease. So, I mean, these are some of the reasons that the Middle Ages has a bad rap. And that's fine. That doesn't mean that it's not interesting to study, because it certainly is. This map I wanted to show you just because it gives you an idea of why we tend to call this period the migration period. So the migration period refers to this period in the early Middle Ages, this 476 to about 1000, when you have a lot of people moving in to the former Roman Empire and moving out of it or moving around in it, acquiring land and acquiring kingdoms and influencing one another artistically and otherwise. So you can see some of those roots. A lot of folks coming from the east to the west, a lot of folks moving around, right? And you can also see a nice list of some of these barbarian groups, these groups with really individual identities. The Vikings, the Jutes, the Angles, the Saxons, Burgundians, Franks, Vandals, Huns, Lombards, Ostrogoths, and Visigoths. All right. Now, before we move on, I did want to emphasize one thing, and this is something I talk about in your packet, so it is there for you. But that the system of feudalism, I mentioned that feudalism is one of the reasons, people tend to dislike the Middle Ages in general, because they see feudalism as something new, which it really wasn't. But that it was so widespread, which it was. That is a very important point. Another important point that makes feudalism so kind of devastating to the lower classes in the West during the Middle Ages is the fusion of secular rule with the church rule. So Rome, right, and the Catholic Church exerted a large amount of influence, very heavy influence, on what we would call secular leaders. That is, the dukes, the duchesses, the kings, the queens in these new kingdoms around Europe. So that feudalism really is a system of reciprocity, that is reciprocal, that is, I give you something, you give me something, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. And the two recipients of that are the church and the secular leaders. So people we would kind of generalize and call them lords and ladies, the lords and ladies of these different kingdoms. The church had their back and they had the church's back. And that was to the detriment of just about everyone else, right, in the Western world. And that's what made feudalism so entrenched in Europe. So while the idea of agricultural slavery wasn't new, the idea of this sort of really entrenched reciprocal system was pretty new between the church and secular rulers. So secular, of course, meaning non-religious rulers, right? So like a king or queen or duke or duchess, etc. So I've got some really specific examples to show you of how that actually worked, but later on, especially with Charlemagne. But I did want to, just kind of give you an idea of what that meant. So what that meant was, when you're a lord or a lady and you own a bunch of land, right, and you want people to work it, you basically enslave people. And the church and the church's wealth, right, is there to assist you with that. And then you, in return to the church for exerting their influence in your good situation, you have warm bodies to send off to the crusades in war, right? So again, kind of a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours situation between the church and the secular rulers. Now, what we're going to talk about here with this next batch of artwork that we're going to look at is this general sort of definition of what we call barbarian or migration period art. So we're going to see some early pieces from this period that belong to Frankish peoples, Merovingian peoples, Celtic peoples, lots of different barbarian groups. And we're going to talk about what this artwork looks like at this time and why it looks this way and why it takes the form it does. Okay, so we're going to start out with a general discussion of barbarians and migration period of art to talk about these early pieces. And then we're going to move on to chronologically to some specific groups of people. We're going to move on then to the Hiberno-Saxons, to the Norse, and the Viking. And then in the next video, we'll talk about the Carolingians and the Etonians, okay? So let's continue then with just sort of general barbarian and migration period art and what it looks like. So what you're looking at here is a cache of jewelry from a grave of a queen, Queen Arnegund, who was a Frankish queen. And what you're seeing is pretty typical of early barbarian or migration period art in that it is wearable art. So we have pins, we have earrings, we have rings, we have a buckle, and they're made of, since this is a queen, very precious materials, gold, silver, various jewels, especially garnets, are very popular, as well as glass and glass paste. So when you're looking around at this image, you notice this is very beautiful, very finely crafted, but what you don't see usually are not a whole lot of images. So this jewelry often has a sort of abstract beauty to it, patterning. Something we also see, I'll try to note these stylistic items as we come across them, bosses, right? So these bosses are like kind of like nails or buttons. You will also see something that we call cloisonné. This is a term that is in your vocab. It's in, I think, in the second column of your vocab. It's a French word that describes this type of inlay of glass into a gold metal surface. Here's another example. This is a Visigothic example. It's one of a pair. It's the better preserved of the pair. It's a brooch, also a pin. So even though it's figural and it's very artistic, it is still something to be worn. And it is also gilt, that is covered in gold, but it's bronze, so slightly less, sort of less fancy, with lots of crystals and garnets and other kinds of gemstones. You can see that these are pretty big. So this is, you know, about 5.5 inches tall, a pretty big brooch. And usually these brooches came in pairs because they would be often on either shoulder to hold two halves of a cloak together. So you see here there is an image. There's an image of an eagle, but this eagle is typically, as we'll see in barbarian art, very flattened, very abstracted. You see sort of like very symmetrical, except for the head, of course, and very simplified with the beak and the eye and the wings, looking very sort of very flattened, patterned in a way that's not realistic. You get a little bit of a sense of overlapping of feathers, I think, in the bottom here, but not much. That's very typical of this style, which we also tend to call barbarian style, migration style, or animal style. Often the word animal style is given to art of this time period because animals are often the focus of it. Even when we don't see them at first, there are often animals in barbarian or migration period art. So here we see a Danish brooch. So this is probably, the Gummersmark brooch is going to be probably, let's see, it's going to be Angles, probably. Oh no, it says Saxons right there. So you see that this is gilt silver. So this is silver that's covered in a layer of gold. And at first it looks, okay, this is completely abstract. It's symmetrical. This fits. It's a large piece of jewelry. This fits our definition of these early barbarian jewelry pieces. We do notice, though, there are some images of animals. So when you look carefully, you see that images of animals with open mouths and lolling tongues, sometimes creatures that we can't really tell what they are, seem to be creeping about or wrapping around things in the jewelry. You even see little birds' heads here and there, highly abstracted, right? And a lot of what we would call open work, that is, you know, basically where there's a lot of sort of working through the metal into to add open spaces. We might call that filigree as well. Another couple really great examples. So we have two from the Merovingian tradition, two fibulae, which are also pins, and two of them, which we would expect. We can see our very abstracted animals. Here we have either hawk's heads or duck's heads with garnet eyes, just like we saw before. We can see fish in a sort of flattened image. And we see that it is once again silver with gilt over the top. So even though these artists are not making because they tend to be migratory people, they're not making giant sculptures out of marble. They're not making, huge stone castles yet, because they're still migratory. These small precious items that can be worn on them and taken with them make for great status symbols, and great a great way to keep your wealth close to you when you're moving about. Okay, so I think this is one of the last pieces from this barbarian and migration period art section. This is one of several pieces that come from a pretty, from up to this point we would call unique, but not completely unique in the West, which is a ship burial. So a ship burial is kind of what it sounds like, where you have an entire ship has been buried with the dead inside. So the ship sort of serves as a coffin or sarcophagus. And then that dead person or people are buried with a number of things, as people, as we know, tend to be buried with things, especially high status people. And these were some things that were found. So this ship burial, known as the Sutton Hoo ship burial, was found in England. It is Anglo-Saxon, as a lot of England was at that time. And so we have some excellent pieces that were maybe sometimes accompanying other kinds of materials. So like here, this is the purse lid. You can see it has hinges at the top and a clasp at the bottom, but the purse itself is gone because it was probably made of leather or fabric, and that has since deteriorated. And whatever was in the background has deteriorated as well, and they've sort of placed a piece of probably white paper or plastic behind it so that you can see the images better. It might have been some other material, maybe even leather behind it. So you can see cloisonne. You can see where there's gold, that the surface is inlaid flush with the gold so it doesn't stick out. In garnets and glass. Enamel is liquefied glass that is poured and basically painted on, and this blue here is enamel. Some of the red is enamel too, or glass paste as it's sometimes known, and some of it is garnets. Right? And very typical, we've got our sort of abstracted animals. Here we have a duck being, it looks like, sort of clawed and eaten by a bird of prey. Very abstracted. We can even see two abstracted critters heraldically on either side of a human figure, which we don't see very much of. And then there's one more thing I want to point out about animal style that appears here, and that is this use of this sort of ribbon-like decoration. Can you guys see these? Sort of ribbon or string-like decorations that seem to wrap about and form patterns or wrap around everything. They're often attached to animals. They're often sort of the form of animals' bodies, these interlacings as they're called, or their tongues or their tails wrapping in and about each other. And so interlacings become a huge part of all of these barbarian migration period art styles. You can see lots of examples of this here from a belt buckle at Sutton Hoo. You can also see bosses, right, on the buckle. And you can occasionally see an eye, right, of a creature. So you can see that the animal style is still there. It's just a lot more abstract than it is in other places. Here you can see the cloisonne very well. I think you can see how cloisonne is formed. You have a base of gold or some metal, and then you have these little threads of metal that you shape and then attach to the surface, and then you fill in the space between them, right? Almost like a paint by numbers, but you have to cut the stones or spread glass paste or enamel into it, which is then baked and hardened. And this is a wonderful class from Sutton Hoo. Again, all wearable. There are lots of other things from Sutton Hoo too, like armor and stuff. And we have one more ship burial we're going to look at in the Norse and Viking art shortly. You can see those interlacings. You can see too how sometimes it looks like these beasts, these little beasts, are biting their own bodies, their own interlacing bodies. And so that's why we often call them gripping beasts. They're either grasping at or biting at each other's tails. And this is just another view of the same class, so you can just see how three-dimensional this surface is, even though it appears very flat in some photographs. So let's talk about Hiberno-Saxon art. So, what we find with Hiberno-Saxon art, which is art of Ireland and England during this period from about 600 to 750, is that you're having the barbarian migration or animal style that we've been looking at merged with some Roman elements, as well as, of course, Christianity. So now that we're moving further into the Middle Ages, art is becoming a large amount of art is being made in production in the service of Christianity. So one major way this happens is through the creation of illuminated manuscripts. So illuminated manuscripts are, as we've talked about, books that are illustrated, but don't just have necessarily illustrations of what's happening. They also have other kinds of images to decorate the book to enhance your experience of reading the book. And a very important type of book in production in the Hiberno-Saxon world of Ireland and England and Scotland is the Gospel book. So remember, the Gospel book is a gospel book, or is a book that has all the Gospels in it, the 4 Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so I've got some pages of some Hiberno-Saxon Gospel books to show you. Now, these seem to have been made almost exclusively in the Hiberno-Saxon world by monks and nuns. They were very high quality, such high quality that they were exported to the mainland of Europe and used to start up churches and cathedrals in Western mainland Europe. Now, something else that is a little interesting, I think, about the Hiberno-Saxons is that because these monasteries produced such great artwork and they sold it, they became very, very wealthy, which we don't often see with monasteries throughout the world. And because they were very wealthy, they weren't as reliant on Rome. Because the church by this time has a lot of money. The church has a lot of money through this reciprocal relationship with the lords and ladies throughout the Western world. And frankly, the monasteries in the Hiberno-Saxon world don't really need them. And Rome did not like this. They liked their monasteries to be dependent on them. They didn't like them to be independent. So this is something of a bit of a bone to pick between the Hiberno-Saxons of Ireland, England, and Scotland, and the mainland and the main church itself, of course, based in Rome. So let's take a look at some of these. So we've got a page here from the Gospel Book of Duro. And it is a page that is a frontispiece to the Gospel of St. Matthew. So St. Matthew is one of the evangelists, right? So he has a gospel book, and this is not St. Matthew that we're seeing in this image. Instead, this is St. Matthew's symbol. Remember, each of the gospel writers had a symbol. Each of the evangelists had a symbol. Well, Matthew's was the man, right? And so this is just a man. We take a close look at this man. He's very flattened. He has little sort of feet and a head sticking out from behind a cloak. And the cloak, for all intents and purposes, to me, looks like the design of a piece of migration period jewelry. It looks like cloisonne, looks like inlay. And then we look at the border around the image of man from Matthew's frontispiece. It has interlacings, has those ribbon-like, beautiful, intricate ribbon-like images. So, images that barbarian/migration/animal style artists were doing in previous centuries is being incorporated into this Christian art. Here's also an image of man, the symbol of Matthew, from another book, the Ecternot Gospels. You can once again see a very flattened, very unrealistic, it's pretty much typical the style of human representation that we would see in the barbarian/migration period, and lots of interlacings in the borders. Now this is probably, the Book of Kells is probably the most famous of these Hiberno-Saxon manuscripts. And that is because it is just enormously beautiful and very intricate. The frontispieces to each of the Gospels are amazing, and they're also filled with other pages that are known as carpet pages filled with decoration. If you look at this page, it is not a frontispiece in that it's not an image of man. It is the Gospel Book of Matthew, but instead it's the first 2 words of the Gospel Book of Matthew. So we have the key, the X-like shape. The rho is this P-like shape that actually is an R sound, key, rho, and then the I, iota. So these 3 letters are meant to imply Christos, or Christ. And then down here we have the word generations. So it's the beginning of the book of Matthew. So notice they've taken these letters and turned them into something gorgeous, turned them into something as intricate, maybe even more intricate than the pieces of jewelry that we've seen. Interlacings that are so tiny we can't even see them from this far away. Also spirals, these sort of three circle sort of patterns which are popular in Celtic art, remain to be popular in Hiberno-Saxon Christian art. And some of the images are shown, like here you can see how it's incredibly tiny. This is this section right here. And remember, this page is only 12 inches high, right? So this is this section here, how intricate those tiny interlacings are. And we even have some images. We have a human's head terminating the R in that one. And then we have images of cats and mice and rats with look like they're fighting over a wafer used for the Eucharist. It's a few more pages from the Book of Kells. You can see here too, again, the fantastic beasts, right, with the like a lion head on top of a snake body. You can see here how the tongue gets wrapped up in and becomes sort of becomes an interlace. It even gets wrapped up all throughout the rest of the image. And then the letters are really kind of got this sort of stained glass-like appearance to them. Notice too, it's the capital letters that are heavily decorated here. The Tunc Crucifixerunt, the T, is highly decorated. This is a T. And same here, another key row and iota page from the Gospel of Matthew of the Lindisfarne Gospels. Lindisfarne Gospels is really interesting, has an interesting history, and I encourage you to read your book section on it on page 436 to 437. Here's one of those carpet pages I mentioned, because they look like a carpet, right? And they're often used to separate sections. Basically a very intricate, again, collection of designs, including spirals, including circles, including interlacings and fantastic beasts, gripping beasts. All right. Then again, with the Lindisfarne Gospels, because it's got this interesting history, sometimes we see interesting things. We're seeing a little bit of a preview here of the more sort of Roman style that we'll see later with the Carolingian Empire. So you have, in this case, Matthew writing his gospel with the image of man waiting in the background to inspire him. And he's shown as a Roman scribe seated on a little bench, and then this little curtain meant to imply that we're in an interior scene. And the words imago hominis, meaning the image of man, right behind him, the symbol of Matthew. All right. So I think a couple last items from the Hiberno-Saxon tradition that are in metalworking and other sort of sculptural. Yeah. So one we have is a known as the Athlone plaque, which is an image of the St. John's crucifixion. This is a kind of image that's done in what's known as repoussé. Repoussé is also in your vocab. It's in that first column. And repoussé is a type of metalworking technique where images are created from a flat sheet of metal by pounding very lightly with a jewelry hammer from the back. So this would be an example of repoussé. And then it's probably also engraved on the front with the images. But you can see the spirals and you can see the interlacings that we've been seeing in jewelry and in book pages. So this is a St. John's crucifixion. We can see the two soldiers sort of torturing Christ, and you see again the lack of care for realism. Christ is, easily twice the other people's size. It's not meant to look very realistic, but instead it's got this sort of very flat and very sort of monumental, symmetrical look to it. This was probably not literally used as a plaque. It was probably, at least at one time, used as a book cover. Book covers were very expensive. You can imagine they were made very nice because books were considered very precious. They took a long time to make, and so they were bound very carefully in wood. They were usually even chained down to the places where they were kept in monasteries or in libraries so that no one could run off with them. And so it makes sense that book covers would be so beautiful. The problem is, of course, that when books, often the bindings wear out, when they're rebound, sometimes that pretty cover gets repurposed into something else. And I think that's what happened with the Athlone plaque. It ended up in somebody's collection. And then one final thing for Hiberno-Saxon art is a Celtic cross. This is known as the South Cross, and it is a pretty typical sort of type of cross you would find even today talking about Irish Catholicism. That is a regular cross but with a circular sort of halo or nimbus behind it. You notice there's interlacings and bosses, which definitely place it for us in this Hiberno-Saxon time period. All right, so let's talk a little bit about for our last section, Norse and Viking art. So these are the art forms of people of what we call Sweden, Norway, Denmark today, and we call them Scandinavian or Norse people. You can use those interchangeably. The Vikings are a specific group of people, the seafarers, right? But they are also Norse and Swedish. So these Norse people share a lot of cultural characteristics with the people that we've seen, the other barbarian peoples. They use the same kind of animal style imagery. You can see this fantastic creature whose head's on top of a serpent-like body, but has a sort of feline face. It has interlacings, right, and sort of abstract patterning. But there are some things that are different. For one thing, we see a lot of wood that remains to us from the Norse people. And that is not so much, it's not that people didn't use wood for art in sort of the lower parts of Europe, it's just that it seems to have been preserved better in Northern Europe. And then, of course, a lot of the stuff is done for boats, right? We see a lot of artwork like this ship post, and boats are a great place for artwork. Now, this is the ship that was found in Oseberg, Norway, in a ship burial. So this is our second ship burial. The first one was Sutton Hoo in England, and this one is the ship burial at Oseberg in Norway. This is an interesting ship burial because, again, because of the different conditions, ecological conditions, the bodies were preserved as well as some fiber or fabric items too. And it seems fiber and fabric were very important throughout, as we would imagine, as they are throughout the world, very important to our early Middle Ages people. And what's also interesting is because the bodies remained behind, we found out that they are female. They're actually two females. There was one female who seemed to be a queen or some other very, very high class, high sort of status individual based on her clothing, her health, etc. And then a woman who was with her who may have been an attendant, had slightly less sort of wealthy looking clothing, was probably a servant who may even have been killed with her to send her into the afterlife with a servant. But anyway, the Oseberg ship burial is an awesome discovery. And there's a website out there where you can even see examples of the kinds of fabric items that were found on the ship. And here you can see how interlacings and gripping beasts biting and gripping at one another, form these beautiful, intricate, ribbon-like patterns here as well. We also see interlacings on another art form in the Norse or Scandinavian world, which are rune stones. So rune stones are stones that are covered in runes, the Old Norse lettering. And there's a particular grouping of them in Jelling in Denmark that were commissioned by Harald Bluetooth, the then king of Denmark. And one of them actually has, I think you can see, a crucifixion on it. So we can see at this point, at least Harald Bluetooth and his company have converted to Christianity. And notice that the Christ is crucified, his arms are spread wide, and he seems to be entwined in these delicate interlacings, these rope-like or ribbon-like designs. Here we can also see those interlacings and creatures at work in a portal to a church. Now, churches in the Scandinavian world are really interesting. They're what we call stave churches. So staves are the four main posts that build the main hall of this church, right? So if we're looking at an image of the interior, the staves, the staves are these large posts that hold up the main hall. So it's open all the way to the top. It's sort of like a basilica plan church, but it's much more, as you can see, vertically rather than longitudinally oriented. They're meant to be very, very tall rather than long. And they're also made of wood, and they have this sort of, because of the height of them and the multiple tiers, they have this really sort of unique appearance to them. The stave churches do. There's only a couple that are still really well preserved in Norway, and Borgund here, the one at Borgund, is very well preserved. All right, well, that is it for this section. My throat is killing me, so I'm going to wait till tomorrow to record the next one on the on the Carolingians and the Etonian Empire. Please let me know if you have any questions.